All right, well, welcome to week 6. This is video number 15. 15. What is metaphysics? Part 1. We're going to talk about metaphysics this week and next week, and that'll conclude our course. Metaphysics is arguably philosophy itself, meaning that metaphysics is a classic large dimension of philosophy, category of philosophy, that existed really as an overarching category, or the category, early on in classical philosophy, and then later in the modern era as a result of the contributions of people like Rene Descartes and rationalists like Spinoza and Leibniz and Berkeley and Hume and German idealists Kant and Hegel and Schopenhauer, has morphed and changed and created for itself a series of subcategories that are fascinating, but a lot more complex than the classical approach to metaphysical questions. The word metaphysics simply means bigger than, or beyond, or greater than meta, the physical. That is to say, everything that we apprehend through our senses. Metaphysical questions then tend to be those kinds of questions that involve, ultimate reality. Is there a God? What is the meaning of life? If there is a meaning, how do I find it? How do we know that the answer to some of these questions, regardless of how passionately we believe in those answers, are real? And finds relation, obviously, to epistemology, which is how we know what we know, which we've discussed already in the class. So some of the specific areas in modern metaphysics have to do with, again, creating subcategories around the idea of ontology, or ultimate substance ontology as it's called, and substance epistemology. That is to say, there are basically 4 to 6 categories, depending on who you talk to, of metaphysics itself, including ontology, the business of being, cosmology, psychology, which as a philosophical category lends itself to the human sciences category, natural theology, axiology, which is the study of values and value systems, and teleology, which is the study of first causes or origins. Again, you can see some parallel between philosophy, metaphysics subcategories in a primary sense, with theology. Theology and philosophy often overlap. In fact, there is a philosophy of theology these days that complicate the question even more. But the point is that philosophy and theology, especially in the realm of metaphysics as a whole, asks very similar questions about beingness, about the ultimate reality of who we are, where we're headed, what the meaning of life is there a God, is there such a thing as good and evil, so on and so forth. So, in a nutshell, that's what metaphysics is about. Where it really sort of the rubber meets the road for our course and class is, again, in the modern or postmodern convolutions of metaphysics. There's a great Shakespearean tragedy. If you're not familiar with Shakespeare, you should try to get familiar with some of his major works. The one I'm referring to now is called King Lear, which is arguably the greatest tragedy ever written. Most scholars believe that King Lear is the greatest tragedy ever written in any language, in at least the Western tradition. It's the story in a nutshell, and there's kind of a joke, long-standing joke about it, that it's kind of a 3-part play where King Lear goes crazy and sort of alienates and excludes his daughters from his inheritance. He then goes even crazier and wanders around on a marsh, and comes to some level of enlightenment about the insanity that he has begun to live out in this later chapter of his life, and then everyone in the third act dies. So that's King Lear. As a tragedy, you can see why it might be considered that. As far as its greatness is concerned, beyond the tragic elements, King Lear is considered to be the only tragic character actually in the story, precisely because he is a representative of the whole and complete human package, or human man or woman. Man in the most generic sense used here. King Lear is the king. He's successful. He's got a tremendous family and lineage. He's got everything, and yet he falls tragically through his own foolishness, only to discover a fresh level of wisdom out of his pain and grief. Yet at a certain point, when he's wandering around on the heath in Act 3, he comes across one of his sons, the better son. Edmund and Edgar are his two sons, one evil and one decent. He comes across his decent son sort of in costume, the costume of a beggar. And he makes this very famous statement. He looks at his son, not realizing it's his son, and ironically says, "Unaccommodated man is no more but such a poor, bare, forked animal as thou art. Off, off, you lendings." A more modern translation of that phrase, which is always helpful with Shakespeare because it's 16th, 17th century, whatever it is, English that no one can read anymore. The human being, unburdened by the trappings of civilization, is no more than a poor, naked, two-legged animal like you. Off with these clothes borrowed from animals. In other words, unaccommodated man becomes a picture of man disconnected from his most civil inventions and framework and structure, to become unaccommodated, that is to say, disconnected, homeless, lost in the most existential, that is to say, metaphysical sense. I'm giving you the picture of King Lear and that scene because unaccommodated man is really a metaphysical or existential statement. And for Shakespeare to include that is what elevates, in part, the drama to a kind of universal tragedy. That is to say that, as you and I know as Christians, without salvation, without God, we are unaccommodated. We are lost. And all of that means that all the trappings of all that we can muster to protect ourselves, to enlighten ourselves, to talk ourselves into believing that we're, the highest level of the food chain, the supreme and supreme creation of creation itself, whether we believe in God, that we are the pinnacle of living being, that we have meaning and substance and significance in the universe and in the future. All those things really are illusory, and that without a real tie to meaning and truth and significance that exists outside of ourselves, we are unaccommodated. Again, all of this is the business of metaphysics. How do we become accommodated? In other words, how do we become people that are not just all talk, that are not just believing their best, personal mythology, but rather are actually established in the world as meaningful, sometimes tragic, but most of all supreme beings in the reflection of some greater good? Well, the Christian faith answers that. We are created as human beings in the image of God, right? And as such, we are given the greatest of all levels of dignity and responsibility and stewardship and all the rest, so that Christian theology, derived of the New Testament experience, really is a metaphysic for living that answers all the biggest questions. But it's not the only metaphysic out there. And so part of appreciating and knowing what metaphysics is about, especially as it relates to postmodern, late modern thought, is understanding that it is the framework of thought that deals with the ultimate questions, that answers whether we become or are accommodated to the universe, hostile as it is, within which we live, or we are forever disjointed from it, in hostile conflict with it, outside, as it were, the realm of any kind of possible meaning, and as a result, we are beggars, we are fools wandering through the marsh. That's the Shakespearean image. Again, let me bring it all to a point to say that, in postmodern or late modern thought process, we are unaccommodated. That really kind of is the absurd, logical conclusion of a postmodern worldview that is distinguished, as we saw at the beginning of the class, with a rejection of nominalism, or the idea that there are universals or some kind of blueprint or template that establishes what is and what isn't in the universe, and thus gives a framework of meaning, and the rejection that there is anything outside of us of objective truth, that really truth is down to what we decide or arbitrarily promote as that which is most kind of desirable or obviously best. When you reject the idea that there's a meaning outside yourself and a truth outside yourself, you are essentially affirming that you're unaccommodated, that it's just you in a mad universe, and that whatever meaning and truth exists has to be generated within your own self. And again, as desperate and as strange as that sounds, that's really functionally where a lot of people live who buy into the postmodern mood or atmosphere or zeitgeist that we talked about early on. Their metaphysic is one of absurdity and despair, actually. And I think it's important as we think about kind of, again, the evolution of metaphysical thought and where that sort of underlies and creates a foundation for these qualities of postmodern and late modern thought that are so operative in our culture, that we realize, where this is all headed and why that postmodern view is so opposed to a Christian worldview. So there's much more to say about metaphysics, obviously a huge set of topics and subtopics, but in a nutshell, that's really what it's all about. So I hope that that's helpful, and as you go through the slides and you think through the ramifications and implications of the entire set of questions that goes with metaphysical reflection, that you'll keep what I'm saying centrally in mind, because the difference between postmodern and Christian worldview couldn't be any starker, especially with regard to metaphysical questions and their answers. Okay, so we'll see you online and next week. Thanks.